Coach Jamieson, thank you so much for your time. Really looking forward to chatting with you a little bit. I've read a lot of your stuff and a lot of your books and have been really influential in my journey. So for the listeners at home, most people already know who you are, but will you just to go ahead and tell us again a little bit about your background, your motivation, and kind of where you are currently?
Yeah, I started out kind of the traditional strength conditioning path. Worked with football, University of Washington program, and then for Seahawks for a bit, and then really just kind of decided to jump to the private sector because I didn't feel like having to change teams and jobs every few years, which is really what the professional ranks looks like for
Yeah.
most coaches. And so back in 2003, I actually opened my own training facility. Just kind of by happenstance, there was an MMA gym right next door, and I started working with a lot of combat athletes. Pretty early on in the sport, it was relatively unknown, and then as it grew over the years, I started realizing there was a big gap in education out there for how to actually prepare fighters to get ready to fight and different types of combat athletes. So I started writing about that information and wrote a book called Ultimate MMA Conditioning in 2009 and built my website and just kind of started getting into the online education side of things as well. Over the years, I also developed some technology to help monitor fatigue and recovery, and been working with some level of technology for most of my career. So that's an area I've really got into as well. So just kind of as a whole, people tend to think of my work in terms of the conditioning side of things, combat sports and other sports really, as well as HRV technology and how to actually apply it to get better results. So nowadays I do a lot of speaking, consulting, work with a lot of big companies like Lifetime Fitness, a lot of teams around the world, working on our software, Morpheus, which is our recovery platform, and just continuing to get out there and help coaches and trainers and people that want to get in the best shape for their life do it in the smartest, most effective way possible.
Okay. Will you touch on any like difficulties or tips you would have for those who might be thinking of trying to open their own facility for similar reasons?
Yeah, it's a tough road. I would say the biggest thing is my best advice is understand there's a difference between being a trainer and being a gym owner. And a common mistake is thinking, well, I'm a great trainer, I can get clients, so I can therefore run a gym.
Yeah.
But the reality is they're two different skill sets. I mean, being a business owner means learning all the operational aspects. It means managing employees and accounting and marketing and sales and all these different things that really have nothing to do with training itself. And I've seen a lot of trainers open these facilities thinking it's going to be this great easy money and they're going to have clients flooding in. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how good you are. If you can't market and run your business, you're limiting yourself, and you're going to have a lot more struggles. So I would just say spend as much time. If your goal is really to build a facility, opening that up is a big endeavor. So make sure you do your homework. Make sure you understand what's actually required from the business side. And know what you're getting yourself into, because it's not as easy as I think a lot of trainers initially think it's going to be.
Yeah. No, I agree. And what would be your biggest tips in terms of business?
Just in general, I think it's similar to training in the sense that you have to have systems in place. Otherwise, if you have no systemization in your business, you have no processes in place to execute the things that have to get done every day, then it's going to be a mess. So just in general, I would say there's a need to understand what the basic components are, how they work together, and just spending the time educating yourself in those different areas. You don't have to be good at everything. You don't have to be a marketing expert, a accounting expert, but you have to at least know the basics. So if you do bring people on board, you can make good decisions about who to work with and who not to. So I would just say approach it from the same standpoint as training. You have to educate yourself. You have to constantly be learning, and you have to basically constantly be evolving and making sure that you're building your business as effectively as you're building your training knowledge.
Yeah. No, I love that. Okay. And so you kind of touched on education already a little bit, right? But what is your take on the importance of education, and kind of let's talk about your personal education journey?
Yeah, I started out actually as my undergrad in business. I went to the University of Washington. There really wasn't a sports med or physiology or any sort of program related to that. So, there's pros and cons. I think a lot of the people that come up in a strict background from a college setting or even higher level education, they get very locked into academia and kind of that mindset of looking at one specific track, and they go down that path. What I've always tried to do is get outside of that and try to understand the bigger picture. So I've looked at biology and physiology and neurochemistry and neuroeconomics and all sorts of different fields outside of the traditional scope of what an exercise physiology major would go through. So I think that the key is just always be open, to always be learning, to look for different resources, to try to connect the dots from different places,
Mm-hmm.
and to not get stuck in your own head of thinking this is what I know and I'm going to just keep doing this over and over again. So I think as long as people have the right mindset when it comes to learning, it doesn't really matter if your background is a traditional college education or you're self-taught or whatever the case may be. I think learning is learning, and you just have to have that right mindset of being open to new things and new ideas and new research and new ways of looking, rather than being stuck on what you have always done or what you think is right. There's always something more to learn.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, right? A lot of people in academia, they do get stuck in those little boxes of like, this is what the book says, this is what the specific research says on a specific population, so this must be true for all. So I think that's a really important point that a lot of people need to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, not to pigeonhole everybody, I've worked with a lot of people that are smart, that have strong educational backgrounds in academia, that do a great job, and I've worked with people that are entirely self-taught, that have never even been to college, that do a great job. So, again, I think that maybe the biggest thing that going to college or having that background is it teaches you, just how to learn in general, and it helps you at least in that process. But again, I think everyone's different. Their learning styles are different. Some people do well in a formal setting. Some people do well studying their own. I mean, it just depends on the person, I would say. But what I liked about, kind of my approach is, again, I didn't have to follow a specific track. I didn't have to read a specific textbook to pass a specific class.
Yeah, I like that.
I was able to learn what I was most interested in and what I thought was most relevant and where I thought my biggest knowledge gaps were, and focus on closing those gaps and learning areas that I didn't know anything about, rather than just kind of going down a linear path of whatever the curriculum for my college has set out for me.
Yeah. Do you feel that the retention of that kind of the literature and stuff that you read, do you feel like it was easier because it was so self-driven, or how do you play that?
I don't know. I mean, for me, I've always looked for different areas where, again, I feel like I don't have the most amount of knowledge, or at least as much knowledge as I want, and I just dive headfirst into that. And so I think just going all into one area and then zooming back out to see how that area relates to other areas, and then kind of going through that process over and over again, has helped me retain stuff, because I've learned how to apply it, or at least tried to learn how to apply it into different areas. So, for example, I started looking at neuroeconomics, which is really about the study of how our brains make decisions and how we make decisions, and what is the actual science behind how the brain calculates and looks at different things. So you look at that field, it seems sort of unrelated to training, but then you can jump out and actually look at what motivates someone to get in the gym, what motivates someone to push themselves to their limits, what motivates someone to quit the gym, and why do people make these decisions to train or not train. And you realize all these different things are related. So I think the biggest thing that comes to retention is understanding how you connect the dots, and then that's the biggest thing, rather than you don't have to memorize specific formulas. I couldn't tell you that the table of elements anymore. Who cares? It's not the specifics or these little minute details that people get caught up in trying to memorize. It's more about just trying to how to understand and relate the concepts to one another in a meaningful way that's going to help you actually do something with the information.
Interesting. Okay. And would you recommend any specific literature on neuroeconomics, if you were gonna...
there's a course on Coursera, which is a popular online learning platform for people who don't know, and it's just Introduction to Neuroeconomics by a Russian guy named Vasily something. But it's a great course. It goes through and introduces the basic concepts, and again, I think it's fascinating to study how we make decisions, and really kind of ultimately realize a lot of it's much more subconscious than people like to think it is, and our brains are wired to kind of make the easy decisions for us, which happens most of the time. We're more in autopilot than we think we are, and then some of the more complex decisions, are obviously a bit higher cognitive in nature. But it's fascinating stuff, because again, it's human behavior, and it's what drives people to excel in the gym, what drives people to excel in life and performance-wise. I mean, there's all these unanswered questions I think we can understand more about by studying, again, kind of outside the box of traditional training.
I love that. And have you found anything that can affect training as far as in the short term in terms of neuroeconomics? Or
yeah, absolutely. I mean, give you one example. A lot of what motivation comes down to in decision making is how the brain perceives the expected utility or the expected benefits of doing some amount of work, because at the end of the day, any type of work is an expenditure of energy, and the body and the whole brain are designed to conserve energy on some level. And ultimately, the brain's going to look at, is option A or option B a better use of my energy and my time and my work? And working out is a very energy intensive process to begin with. So in order for somebody to really stay motivated to work out, their brain needs to perceive a reward or an expected reward.
Mm-hmm.
And when that expectation of reward happens, dopamine levels rise when you think about working out or you get ready to work out, and that drives behavior to actually work out. So what you find is, there's a reason that everybody goes in the gym in January, everybody quits in February, right?
Yeah.
And the reason is because as soon as results start to slow down, the brain
Mm-hmm.
says, wait a minute, I just worked for 3 weeks and scale didn't change.
Yeah.
My strength didn't get better. As soon as the brain starts to perceive that, hey, why are you doing all this work? There's no real reward.
Yeah.
You become inherently, and subconsciously demotivated to continue doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
So it really comes down to, if you're working with clients, athletes, whoever, it's framing what are the expectations, because again, it's more about the expectation of reward than the reward itself. So people have very unrealistic expectations because it's driven by marketing, it's driven by headlines and bullet points, and lose 5 pounds in a week or gain 20 pounds in a month. I mean, all these ridiculous numbers they're physiologically impossible. If you go into a workout or a program expecting these things to happen, when they don't, you become demotivated to continue the training. So a lot of it comes down to proper goal setting, proper expectations, realizing what's physiologically possible and what's not, understanding that progress is not always linear, and just setting up that framework so that, again, people don't go into these training scenarios with ridiculously unrealistic expectations. So that's a good overall application of how we can look at neuroeconomics and decision making to help keep people motivated to do what we want them to do.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I haven't heard too much about that. Is that a relatively new topic, or has that been out for a while?
No, I mean, neuroeconomics has been a field that's come up over the last, 10 to 15 years.
Okay.
It's really not, I've never heard anyone talk about it in a training standpoint aside from myself, honestly, but it's got a lot of applications, I think, in different areas of health and fitness just because it helps explain our behaviors.
Yeah, no, I agree. Okay. So moving forward a little bit, right? How have you been able to kind of, we talked about fighters and how you kind of got into that a bit, but how have you been able to pinpoint conditioning needs, kind of using some of that technology that you were talking about?
Yeah, a lot of it is really just kind of understanding what are the demands of the sport, and then essentially looking at what do the successful athletes in that sport have from a physiological standpoint that the less successful ones have, or specifically in conditioning. What does a well-conditioned athlete in combat sports look like compared to an unconditioned athlete? And so using technology like heart rate variability, just looking at heart rate during training, VO2 max, different types of things to measure, what's going on internally. I was able to profile and essentially say, this is what a high-level combat athlete looks like, so that when I work with a new athlete, I can essentially say, well, here's this person's weak points in relation to what it looks like to be successful, and I can attack those weak points. So a lot of it, again, it's just building a model. It's understanding what makes someone successful in the sport, what makes them tick internally, and then being able to use technology to help assess and then make decisions from there. And that's really what it's come down to is, now I have a very firm idea of what HRV and resting heart rate and different levels of power output and different endurance tests. I know what those numbers should be, so that when someone comes in, I can evaluate them quickly and see very easily whether or not they have the right physiological tools, or there are certain areas they need to work on, or what the case may be.
Good. Okay, that's really interesting. So why do you like HRV as opposed to other modalities?
HRV is really the single best metric we have in terms of understanding how our bodies are, really are recovering and handling stress. And ultimately, when it comes down to it, training is nothing more than a very specific form of stress that causes us to, adapt and improve to it. So we want to have a gauge of how well our body is able to do that. And so HRV is broadly correlated to all these different areas because it's a measure of how our body is distributing energy, more or less.
Okay.
When we see our body distribute energy into dealing with stress, whether it's physical or mental, we see one pattern in HRV. When we see our bodies putting energy into recovering from that stress and regenerating and rebuilding and getting better, we see a different pattern in HRV. So it just allows us to have a really clear insight into how well someone is responding, and how well they're putting together all the pieces. Because again, we tend to think in terms of training, because that's what most coaches and trainers do all day, is they sit in the gym and they train people. But the reality is, what your clients and people are doing outside the gym, their sleep patterns, their activity, their mental stress, their supplementation, all these things play a much bigger role than we realize. And if you have no way of gauging the effects of those things, then you're really just left to guess about what should be done in the gym. But again, if you're guessing, there's a good chance you can be wrong, a fair amount of the time. So the more you can accurately gauge and see where someone's at, the more you can fine tune and personalize their program to make sure that all their pieces of their lifestyle, from again their training to their nutrition and mental stress and sleep, are all fitting together in a way that's going to lead them down the path they want to go. Versus maybe you're doing everything right in the gym, but all these other areas are sabotaging the progress they're making, And if you had no way of gauging that, then you really wouldn't know what the cause was. You think maybe your program is broken. Maybe your program's great, but everything else they're doing is causing them to not see those gains.
Yeah. Okay, I agree. And so with that, right, so what would you recommend for those who might not be in a financial position to purchase HRV?
About the only thing you can do is measure resting heart rate in the morning. You can get look at your clock and count your resting heart rate for a minute to kind of see where you're at. If you start seeing large variations, and I would say by a large variation, I would say more than like a swing of, let's say, 5 beats per minute.
Yeah.
Either up or down. That's a bit of an indication there's something's going on there. So, for example, if my normal resting heart rate's, let's say, 60 to 62 kind of on average, and all of a sudden it hits 70, or all of a sudden it drops down to 50, that's a pretty clear sign that something is going on there. It tends to be a much more lagging indicator than HRV. We tend to see things a lot more quickly with HRV and a little bit slower with changes in resting heart rate like that. But if you don't have anything to invest in any technology, that's really kind of the poor man's way to go about it.
Yeah. I guess there's not too much else you can do, right? So
no, not really.
Interesting. Okay. On a different podcast, you kind of mentioned how conditioning may be more important than strength in certain situations, right? So will you elaborate a little bit on types of sports where this may be true?
Well, I mean, it kind of depends on how we define those things. I mean, realistically, what conditioning is your ability to express your strength across the entire competition or entire event that you're actually doing. So all the strength in the world isn't going to do you a whole lot of good if you're too fatigued to actually use it. So
good point.
Conditioning is really just that. It's a measure of how well you're able to use your strength and use your skill and your power, across start all the way through the finish of whatever it is you're trying to do. So from that standpoint, conditioning is really what allows you to enables you to use exactly the strength that you've developed. So I would say I don't know that I'd say it's more important, but it's your ability to use it. So if you don't have the ability to use it, then all the strength in the world, again, doesn't do you any good if you're completely fatigued. And then, from a health standpoint, there's just massive research now showing that VO2 max and resting heart rate and HRV, these are the things that correlate with life expectancy. And not to say that strength doesn't play a role in some of those areas, but overall cardiovascular health and fitness is really what's going to prevent heart attacks and strokes and the diseases that we see that are so common out there. So from that standpoint, I think we could say conditioning in that regard is more important than strength because again, there's so much research out there showing us how important it is to be healthy from a cardiovascular standpoint.
Okay. And this is a bit of a loaded question, I guess, but how do conditioning and injury prevention kind of play into each other? And is there like a certain level that you've found to work for a certain group of athletes that you've worked with?
For conditioning as far as related to injuries?
Yeah.
Well, conditioning essentially, again, it's allowing us to utilize the strength we have. It's allowing us to have good fundamental movement and good technique. It's allowing us to do the things that we need to do, without breaking down. So if someone's conditioning is poor, a lot of times that results to the body trying to conserve energy. And the way it does that is by compromising some movement quality and compromising some movement patterns or slowing down or doing all sorts of things. And a lot of times that can result in a higher risk of injury if you don't have the muscular endurance in the lower body. Let's say your hamstrings get completely fatigued, it might alter your running mechanics a little bit, and boom, you might pull a hamstring. If you're not conditioned to the environment, you can't handle the volumes, you can't recover from it, you are far more likely to get injured because as we progressively train and we overload our body and we do all these things to it, if it doesn't recover, then it starts to shut down muscle force production to certain areas that have had too much stress. And again, that compromises our ability to move effectively or to express that power output. So there's a huge relationship between the two. And I've actually seen quite a bit. We looked at a lot of different soccer teams in HRV, and you would absolutely see this relationship between people's HRV starting to take a huge change in the wrong direction. And then, they get sick or they get injured or something, their performance just takes a nosedive. So, you can absolutely see the correlation between the two because, again, if your body's not conditioned to the environment, if it doesn't have the capacity to produce the energy you need the way you need it to, then it just compromises everything else, and you're much more likely to have something blow out as you're running down the field or something go wrong.
And then moving forward with that same idea, right? How does energy system development play into like local muscular conditioning?
Sure. I mean, it's all essentially related. I mean, at the end of the day, muscle fibers contract and they need energy in order to do that.
Yeah.
And there's what we'd call like a centralized component, which is, the oxygen supply and how your brain and body work together to pump oxygen and blood throughout your body. And then there's how well the muscles can actually draw that oxygen out of the blood and use it effectively. And that comes down to things like mitochondria and enzymes and all these different things in the muscles themselves. So really we would say that the centralized component is more general, meaning we can develop it with more variety of exercises and more variety of means. And we'd say that muscular endurance is more specific. So, for example, Lance Armstrong couldn't jump in a swimming pool and, beat everybody in distance swimming, even though he has amazing VO2 max and lactate threshold and all those sorts of things. He wouldn't be able to outswim somebody in, a distant event because he doesn't have the specific upper body muscular endurance of a swimmer since he's been on a bike, right? So those are where the specific things come into play is when it comes into specific movement patterns. So you need both. You need basically that centralized engine, that big aerobic engine. Then you also need the muscular endurance to be able to utilize that through the movement patterns that you need to in your sport.
Okay. And then going with that same idea, right? So injury prevention in combat sports, right? Is there even such a thing, or is that just kind of part of the sport?
No, I mean, absolutely, it should be part of the sport. I mean, some people are certainly much more, in tune with being aware of trying to actually prevent injuries than others. But a lot of it comes down to, same as anything else, it's effectively stress management. And a lot of these guys, they go into the gym 6 days a week. They're training 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours a day. And ultimately just that wears them down and they break down and they have either an acute or chronic injury as a result. So, I would say what I see in all sports really is it's the athletes that have been in the game for a while that start to realize the importance of this stuff and taking care of themselves and focusing on sleep and nutrition and managing their training effectively and not going hard every single day and just being smart and strategic about their training. It's the guys, again, that have been in the game for a while that figure this out and start to become much more aware of this. It's the young guys that don't know any better that are 21, 22, think they can go hard every day, but sooner or later, they pay the price and they end up having to make changes to their programs. So it's combat sports are no different than other sports, other than the fact that combat sports are year round. They're always training and they tend to have very high train volumes. So it's just it's a matter of being intelligent about their training and looking at again, how to periodize and how to manage volume intensity and how to put all the pieces together versus this idea that you just have to go to the gym and kill yourself every day.
Okay. And then, so when working with different types of fighters, right? So, say boxers versus MMA versus, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu kind of guys, are there any differences that you attend to, or do you just kind of take a generalist approach?
No, I mean, I'm always specific to the athlete, right? So, we're going to look at what is that athlete's specific weakness or strength or strengths, and what do they need to develop. Maybe they have a specific muscular weakness where every time they get in this position, they start to gas out, or maybe they're maybe it is their central components, their resting heart rate, HRV, are not where they need to be. So you always want to start from an individualization of what does this athlete need to get better? How can I limit his or her limitations so that I can maximize his or her strengths? That's where we always want to start. And then when we talk about getting ready for a competition, you're going to start to structure your conditioning around more specific things. So a boxer that's doing 3 minutes is going to be doing 3-minute rounds is going to be doing things differently than a combat athlete who has a 5-minute round, for example. And you're going to base some of your conditioning things around those specific elements that are going to be part of their given sport. So the basic movement patterns are probably similar in a lot of the combat sports, and some of the overall structure of most MMA matches are 5 minutes, either 3 rounds or 5 rounds with 60 seconds rest. So there's a lot of similarity in a lot of combat sports, but you always want to treat each person and each sport as an individual thing.
I like that. Okay. And then with the idea of periodization, right? So what kind of periodization are you looking at, and how does that change across the board for different groups of athletes?
I'd say there's lots of different periodization models out there. From a big to small standpoint, we always look at more generalized training further out from a competition and more specific training the closer you get to competition. So from a broad standpoint, general to specific is usually the way we're going to go. As a whole, we want to start to get closer and closer to the entirety of the sport environment. So training at the same time of day as a competition, using the same sorts of volumes and intensities are going to be a part of the competition, at least as much as possible, replicating some of the environmental things. That's why football teams will blast crowd noise into their practice field when they get ready to go to play to a loud stadium. You want to start to look at periodization from the broad standpoint of how can we get this athlete closer and closer to the demands of their sport, the closer and closer we get to their actual competition or competitive season, so we can prepare them as much as possible for the actual environment we're going to be in. Because that's one thing people need to realize is you can't separate the skill execution from where you're actually executing it in. So performing your skills in one environment is going to affect you differently than in a totally different environment. If I took somebody up to 5,000 feet, they're going to perform differently because there's different oxygen levels up there, and it's going to affect them. So we just want to think from a broad standpoint of general to specific, and realistically, I think the volume and intensity stuff is is really just a management problem more than anything else. I mean, in general, you gradually increase volume over time. Your intensity is going to be regulated based on your ability to recover, and you, generally speaking, will increase intensity as you get closer to competition and taper off by decreasing volume a little bit. But mostly what it comes down to is just, again, it's that individualization. I've seen a lot of great periodization models, but the reality is, you never know what it's going to look like until you put someone through the program and you monitor and you see what they're actually doing. And you can have all these great sets of reps keep planned out and all these great volume intensity modulations, but the reality is if somebody doesn't recover from it, then it goes out the window. And you have to make adjustments. So I tend to focus more on just that individual aspect of managing volume intensity as opposed to trying to have some overarching model that every athlete goes through.
Okay. And then, I mean, I know you just mentioned that last part there, but generally speaking, what does a peaking kind of look like for competitions for you?
Especially, so a lot of it really just comes down to understanding, again, the specifics of the environment. So combat athlete, let's say they're going to be fighting on the East Coast. They're going to be fighting at 8 o'clock at night. They're going to be doing 5 rounds of 5 minutes. They're going to be in front of an audience and have that mental stress. So it's really about just preparing them for all those specifics. So maybe you shift your training time from the West Coast to where his peak sparring time, which will replicate the sparring or the fight, will be at 5 p.m. Pacific, which is again 8 p.m. Eastern time. It's managing kind of all those little minute details of somebody in terms of the environmental aspects, while at the same time, again, you want to get their intensity up to match what the competition is going to be like, but you want to make sure the volume is managed so they're able to recover from it. So generally speaking, the last couple of weeks, it's just a lot of very specific work, exact number of rounds, exact number of sets, exact rest periods, time of day, the clothing, the warm up, the cool down, all those things need to look like it's going to look in competition. And then it's just a matter of, again, scaling back the volume enough so they can recover without scaling it back too far to where they start to lose fitness. So it's just just because I would say the management becomes more fine-tuned the closer you get to competition. And again, you want to pay closer and closer attention to those environmental aspects and making sure they're ready to perform in that environment they're going to be in.
Okay. So in a kind of accelerated model, right? So say you have a short amount of time between fights or something like that. How does that weekly training structure kind of change?
You just have to be really careful again with the volume and intensity. You don't want to. People's temptation is to ramp up volume intensity too quickly because they think, I've only got 6 weeks. I've really got to go after for 6 weeks. But if depends on what someone's been doing before that, right? If they're already in great shape, then maybe they can handle those workloads. You can ramp things up quicker. But if they haven't been, and they've maybe been training a lot less, or they're not in the same condition, you can't just dump, twice as much work on them as they're used to doing. You still have to have a gradual buildup. You can accelerate that a little bit if you have to, but you just have to be even more mindful in that case of paying attention to their recovery levels, because the biggest thing that causes injuries and problems is too much too fast. If the body's not used to it, you push it well outside its boundaries, it's more likely to fall apart and break. And if you only have 6 weeks, the last thing you can do is afford to get injured in week 3 because you overload yourself the first 3 weeks. So you really just have to pay even closer attention to managing that person's volume and intensity to make sure that you're not trying to compress too much work in too short a period of time, because the body has its limits. When you start to push it past those limits, that's where bad things happen.
Okay. And then one of the interesting things that I kind of wanted to talk to you about is, so circuits are big, especially with young coaches and stuff like that. So what is your approach to intelligently programming circuits?
It depends on what the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish is, but I would say the biggest thing is, if you're looking at varying the movement patterns in different circuits, I think the biggest thing people need to pay attention to is technique, because a lot of times people get caught up specifically in conditioning work with putting together a really hard circuit or some sort of program where they're pushing their athletes to fatigue and all that, which is great. But if their technique is being compromised as a result of being pushed through a circuit and they're just trying to bang out as many reps in a short period of time as possible, then you're setting them up for bad movement patterns, and they're learning how to move poorly when they're fatigued. So I think we always have to be mindful of, no matter what the circuit may be or what intensities we want to be at, I'm going to be programming around making sure that their technique isn't compromised along the way. So, again, it depends on the intensity of the circuit. It would depend on what you're trying to accomplish and what you're trying to do. But in general, I would say the biggest thing, like I said, I've seen is if you put time periods on things, you tell people get as many reps in a short period of time, or you're rushing between exercises without proper rest. You've really got to emphasize the technical aspects of those things, because people, again, they'll inherently the brain will try to conserve energy, and the way it does that is by moving less. And it'll actually be more likely for people to compromise their technique if they're not being coached to have good technique throughout whatever circuit they're doing.
Interesting. Okay. And then moving forward a little bit, kind of on the nutrition front, right? So, for example, athletes that are kind of struggling with some fat loss, right? And if all else is in check, could it be too much training, not enough, or what could be other confounding factors in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, it could be all those factors. Diet plays a huge role in losing fat, obviously, but the big picture comes down to, how much stress the body's under, how much, what the caloric intake versus expenditure looks like. And if you basically have too few calories and you have too much energy, the body starts to try to conserve energy and make you hungrier to eat more calories. I think the biggest thing that you see is people's estimation of how many calories they eat is not very accurate. They've done some studies where they put people on a little workout and they say, well, how many calories do you think you burned? And they'd say 800, and they actually measured it was like 200. And then they'd take them to a buffet and they would say, hey, just try to eat as many calories as you think you burned.
Yeah.
And they would say, oh, I think I ate like 400 or 500. And the reality was they ate like 1100, 1200.
Oh, wow.
So our estimation of calories and consumption is not always very accurate. And our brain, again, the more stress we put our body under, the more our body wants to consume calories to handle that stress. So a lot of it is understanding, again, if you push yourself really hard and you overstress yourself, you're going to end up eating more food than you realize. Completely subconsciously, you're going to minimize the caloric deficit because your brain's going to want to stuff yourself with food. So again, it's all connected. You can't really separate training from diet, from sleep and all these things. If you don't sleep, that affects your nutrition as well, or that affects your weight loss. I mean, all these things come together, and really what it all comes down to is just staying within the limits of what your body can adapt and recover to. You start to push it too much, whether it's too little sleep or it's too much training, not enough good solid nutrition. All those things play a role, and they push your body outside where it wants to be, and it'll fight back. And when that happens, we tend to see poor performance, or we see injuries, or we see inconsistencies, and all those sorts of things. So just got to put all the pieces together.
Interesting. Okay. And then what kind of recommendations would you have in terms of sleeping, right, and sleep hygiene and things like that?
Yeah, the biggest thing is consistency. Most research nowadays is showing us like 79 hours is what most people need. Everyone's a little bit different. There's not necessarily everyone needs exactly 8.2 hours of sleep. That we don't really see that, but in general, like 79 hours of sleep is what most people are going to be able to perform well, are going to recover well. I think athletes that are training hard are going to probably tend to be on the longer side of that, but consistency matters as much as anything. And I can tell you, looking at HRV data over the years, making sure you're going to sleep and waking up at the same time is as important, or sometimes more important, than the total number of hours of sleep that you actually get. And obviously, if you're at the same time every day, you're going to get the same number of hours of sleep anyway. Just being very consistent in sleep, having a good sleep environment, a good bed that's comfortable, room temperature that you sleep well in, good pillows and those sorts of things, and just making sure that, again, you are very consistent in your approach to sleeping as you are in your approach to training and nutrition. I mean, all those things should just be consistent. And I would say that's really what the body thrives in is consistency. It's this random constant change of going to bed midnight one night and 3 a.m. the next night and 9 a.m. the next and 9 p.m. the next day, or eating this food this day and then having a completely different meal schedule the next day, or training all over the place. The more random and inconsistent things are, the less the body likes it, and the more likely you are to see inconsistencies in your performance and your outcomes. So I would just say the more consistent people are in terms of their sleep habits, the better off they're going to be.
Okay. And so kind of interesting thought rose in my head kind of when you're talking about the consistency, right? So as far as mealtime, so what would you say to those that are kind of on the thought process of, we come from a hunter-gatherer like lineage, and so we may not eat consistently because our ancestors, they ate what was available to them?
Well, I mean, eating what's available to you when you're in the wild is a different thing than trying to eat for optimal performance, right? Our hunter-gatherer ancestors weren't trying to run 400-meter sprints or fight each other, in a professional combat athlete. So you have to understand the biology was for survival. So our metabolism is designed to be very adaptable. I mean, we can process protein, carbs, or fats, so we can survive. But there's a difference between what we can survive on and what we're going to perform optimally on. Those are two different things. So yes, we're absolutely adapted and designed to survive a variety of circumstances, but that doesn't mean that those circumstances are going to lead to the best performance outcomes. Those are very different ends of the spectrum. Survival versus optimum performance are two different things entirely.
Okay. No, I like that. Okay. And then what recommendations would you have for those who may be working with a fighter population, right, or those who are trying to move weight classes?
Just in terms of nutrition?
Yeah, in terms of nutrition and just the way to attack training and things like that.
Again, it's gradual changes. It's monitoring as you go along. It's not trying to do too much too fast. I mean, if you're trying to change weight classes, ideally give yourself 4 to 6 months of solid training, nutrition. Either trying to gain or lose weight, depending on what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
Managing hydration, those sorts of things. So I just say it's mostly about slow and steady versus trying to go too fast, and overthinking things and overdoing the process. I've seen athletes cut way too many calories trying to drop a weight class. And again, if you're dropping a bunch of calories and you're training all these hours, your body can't handle it, and sooner or later, it is going to break down. So it's more about just being patient and working with your body rather than trying to fight against it. In most things, but particularly in changing weight classes.
Yeah. Okay. And then in your time in the college realm, right? Have you seen a lot of differences with adaptation in terms of people that are more prone to be morning people versus people that are more prone to be night owls or things like that?
I think in general, yeah. I mean, it's if someone's more of a night person, they're going to perform better, generally speaking, in the afternoon than the mornings, and vice versa. But again, a lot of it comes down to the environment and the consistency factor. So you can override that to some extent as long as they're extremely consistent in their sleep hours and their training hours. They'll do fine. It's again, it's when someone's maybe naturally a night owl, but they're forced to get up early so they don't get enough sleep because they stay up late. that's where you're gonna run the problem. So again, a lot of it is just whatever your biology set up for. If you can perform within those constraints, then great. But if you're in a team environment and you have to train 8 in the morning, then you better learn how to adjust your sleep pattern. You're gonna end up not recovering very well from it.
Yeah, or not on the team, right?
Yeah, exactly. Not on the team, exactly.
Nice. Okay. So what kind of separates you from others that work with fighters, right? And how do you consistently stay at the top of your game?
A lot of it just comes down to trying to learn. No matter how successful you are, there's always a lot more you can learn. I've been very fortunate in that I was able to work with a coach named Matt Hume from the very beginning, and I would say he's the best MMA coach in the world by far. And so, having a great coach to develop the skill side of things is really, I hate to say it, but it's the most important thing. You can get an athlete in great shape, but if his skills aren't there's not a whole lot you can do for him. So. I've been fortunate enough again to work with someone like Matt and to learn from him and see what he was doing with athletes and how he approaches the skill and the game planning and all that sort of thing. But like I said, the biggest thing is just always trying to learn and get better and never being content that I think you got it all figured out. I'm always trying to try new things and see what works and constantly improve.
Okay. So what are some resources that have had a big impact on you, whether it's a book or a podcast or a conference or something like that?
There's been lots of stuff. I'd say kind of early on, I found a book called Super Training by Dr. Mel Siff, and that really opened my eyes up into just all the complexities of training that I really wasn't aware of until I started reading that book. And I just kind of been following a more traditional, like, let's read the magazines or look for programs online. But when you dig into Super Training, you just realize, or at least I realized, how many different moving pieces there were that I had just no real comprehension of. So that was an early kind of eye-opener there, and an influential book just to see kind of how these things come together. And then I would say there's a biologist named Robert Sapolsky that I stumbled onto, I don't know, in 2005 or 6, and his overall understanding of how the human body adapts to stress, how our health and cardiovascular wellness are tied to all these different areas of our lifestyle, and how all these different pieces put together really were influential as well. And I would recommend anybody that's listening go to YouTube and look up Robert Sapolsky, and you can find his entire human behavioral biology class from Stanford online. He's a professor down there, and he's literally taken an entire, I don't know if it's a quarter or a semester of his biology class, human behavioral biology, and put it online for free.
Wow. Okay.
So it's a tremendously valuable resource. He also wrote a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, which is great. So either to pick up the book or go online and watch his course, because he's a tremendously entertaining, incredibly intelligent guy, and you can pick a lot up from. Again, just understanding biology. It's not about just exercise physiology. It's the underlying biology that drives behaviors and decisions and reactions and performance, all those sorts of things. So again, it's just having a bigger macro view, I think, gives you more perspective of all the micro things that are involved.
I like that. Okay. And then kind of moving forward into this last segment, right? Just some things kind of about you personally, right? So if you have any, what are some quotes that you live by?
I don't have a ton. Maybe it sounds cliche, but I guess all quotes are cliche. I'd say probably carpe diem. Just the idea that if you want to do something, live in the moment now, and you never know. I've learned, unfortunately, hard way that life is short. I've had some people close to me pass away over the years, and you just realize you never know if you're going to be around tomorrow, and there's no reason to put stuff off that that you want to do today. So I've tried to always live with that idea of,
Yeah.
if I'm not here tomorrow, what would I do today?
Yeah.
Kind of think from that perspective. And I've never been one to be afraid of taking risks, whether it's starting my own business or trying out new technologies, or I fly helicopters, airplanes, and
Oh, wow.
just,
Okay.
doing things like that I enjoy doing. So,
Yeah.
Again, that's probably the one that's the most, one that hits home the most.
Okay. Is there a thought or experience from your past that you've held on to that has made a big difference in your life now?
Probably just from a career standpoint, when I was first getting into the field, there was a strength coach named Bill Gillespie at the University of Washington. Bill's been there for 15 years. He was a multiple world record powerlifter, a world record holder in powerlifting. Smart guy, extremely strong guy. And I was, a 19-year-old, 20-year-old kid, whatever I was, walking in the weight room and asking if I could help out and work with him. And he was incredibly open to my ideas. I was studying some of the Russian stuff. I was digging into a lot of different areas of training that he was interested in. He literally would sit down in his office with me, and we would just talk about training and ideas, and he would go out and try them. And so just kind of seeing somebody who'd been in the game as long as he was, open to this young kid coming in and talking to him and allowing me to have the opportunity was something that was really impactful. I mean, I've always tried to, have that open mind of, maybe someone doesn't have the experience you have, it doesn't mean they don't have something you can learn from, and also passing along knowledge as much as you possibly can, which is part of why I, write and speak and do these things that I do.
Okay. What is the best advice you've ever been given?
Best advice I've ever been given. Let me think about that one for a second.
Okay.
It sounds being kind of corny, but I think my mom growing up was always just, I don't know if it was specific advice per se, as it was this idea that whatever you want to do, you can do. And I've always kind of taking that approach of no one can tell me what I can and can't do. If I believe in something, then I'm going to go 100% and I'm going to do it. So it really came down to just, again, I was raised a single parent. My mom was working nights, but she always instilled upon us that whatever we wanted to do in life, that we could do. There was no limitation. There was no reason you couldn't be whatever it is you wanted to be. So when I was 23 years old and I started a gym, a lot of people were like, well, you don't know what you're doing. You've never run a business before, but I wanted to find a way to make it work, and ultimately I did. So I think a lot of the advice I would give people is just believe in your ability to accomplish whatever it is you want to accomplish, and don't settle until you have. And if you take that approach, you tend to be more successful than you think you will be. And even if you aren't successful, you learn from those failures, and hopefully you grow from them and get stronger.
Yeah. No, I love that. Okay. So in contrast to that, right, what's the worst advice you've ever been given?
I would say it goes back to that security thing. And a lot of people, when I was starting to open my gym, there was a lot of people saying, well, you should go work for another gym for 5 years. You should go do this. You shouldn't take the risk of, you're 23 years old and, you're going to take a big risk by putting all this money into this gym. And if it fails, you're going to be this and that. You should play it safe.
Yeah.
And, again, I think people that let fear drive their decisions are ultimately going to be limited by that. They're never going to accomplish things they could have accomplished. So again, a lot of the people that said, stay the safe route and don't open a gym and don't put all this money I kind of scrounged and saved and borrowed to do, don't take the risk, was kind of the message of a lot of people. And, ultimately, if I had done that, I would never have ended up in the position I was in. I would never have opened up a gym next to Matt and AMC. I would never work with combat athletes. I would never have gone down the conditioning road. All these things would have never really happened. So, I think it's just the biggest thing is just the people that want to tell you not to do things and have all these reasons why you shouldn't do things. If you believe in it, then I think you should go do it. So that's probably the biggest thing.
I love it. Okay. And then last question here, right? So what are some projects you're kind of currently working on, and how can people reach out to you and kind of follow your journey?
Yeah, the biggest thing we're working on now is just the Morpheus system I mentioned a bit earlier. Morpheus takes essentially all your lifestyle data, your training, your sleep, your activity, your HRV, and it gives you a recovery score each day. And then from that, it gives you some specific heart rate zones. So it gives you a blue zone for the day that will help facilitate recovery, a green zone will help build your conditioning, and a red zone, which is where your overload or your max intensity is for the day. So we're working on essentially taking that platform and developing a coach's version so that coaches and trainers and people out there can see all this data from their clients, and they can have a snapshot of what their clients are actually doing when they're outside the gym, and they can make better training decisions about, again, what sort of volumes and intensities are appropriate. If somebody didn't sleep well or they didn't recover well and they come in with a recovery score of 60%, then you have to be very mindful of that versus somebody comes in with a 90% recovery, 100% recovery. So really just work on the Morpheus platform, and they can learn more of that at just trainwithmorpheus.com. All my articles, basic stuff goes on 8weeksout.com. They can find really all of our videos and resources on 8weeksout.com as well. But specifically if they want to learn more about the Morpheus side, which is where a lot of my effort is going to these days. It's just trainwithmorpheus.com.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much, Coach. This has been great. All your material is great, but this has been awesome to be able to talk with you in this kind of capacity. So once again, I appreciate it, and thank you so much for your time. And I hope we can connect again soon in the future.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
All right, Coach. I'll talk to you later.
All right, take care.